Hello and welcome to this video presentation all about fireworks photography. This was a presentation I gave to my local camera club in October 2021, just before the annual fireworks season is about, just to get everyone up to speed on how to get some great fireworks photos. So to begin with, what makes a great fireworks photo? So for me, and what makes a fireworks photo great is very much a personal preference. But for me, it's on a scale of okay, better, and best. So at one end of the scale, we have photos of a single firework, probably against a nice dark sky. Looks very pretty, but it's not the best that we can get as photographers. So stepping up the scale to get a better photo, we can get photos of multiple fireworks in one shot. And this kind of photo is a lot more pleasing to the eye. It looks more dramatic. But if we want to get the best photos, then we want to combine multiple fireworks with a bit of foreground interest, because it really helps set the scene, helps us to remember where we were at the time of taking the photos, and makes for a much more interesting photo because there's so much to see. But before we go out and start taking photos, we need to think about what the weather's going to be doing on the night of the firework display and where we're going to position ourselves to get that best photo. So the first thing to think about is obviously you want a nice dry night, so you're not getting your camera equipment all wet and broken. But you also need to think about the wind and the wind direction. Obviously fireworks and any bonfires are going to have smoke, and the wind is going to carry that smoke. And if you're downwind, it's going to blow the smoke between you and the fireworks and potentially your foreground interest, and it's going to obscure your view and the view of the fireworks. So what you can do is use an app or website called Windfinder. This is one that I use for my drone photography to get an idea of how windy it's going to be, because if it's too windy, you don't want to be flying your drone and seeing it get carried by the wind off into the distance, as has happened to a few photographers. But for fireworks, it's important that we take into account the wind, how strong it is, and the direction of it as well, because we also want to be upwind of that smoke, so we're away from it. So this is a view of how the Windfinder app looks on my phone. So you can see it's a bit like a heat map. So there are green colors to show wind of kind of 22 to 26 miles per hour, which is fairly breezy. And then blue areas around kind of 13 to 17, so slightly less wind. And we can dial in our date and time that we're looking for the forecast. And what you'll also notice is a number of arrows. So in this case, north is up. So the wind direction is broadly northeastish. So we know if we were taking a photo of fireworks in Weston-super-Mare, we would want to be ideally on the south side of the display area, so the wind carries the smoke away from us. So in a bit more detail, this is where things like Google Maps come in a bit handy to figure out where you might want to stand. So as well as the smoke and wind direction, you also need to think about your foreground interest. Ideal subjects for foreground interest generally are things that don't move or aren't going to move very much. So buildings are really good, kind of static cars, unless you want some light trails of cars. Trees, especially ones without without leaves, if it's windy. And people as well. So a lot of our photography firework displays, there's going to be people around, and whilst they will move a bit, generally they're kind of fixed to the spots because they're kind of joining you in watching the firework display. So hopefully they won't move around too much or look too blurry in your photos. And don't forget that if you want more sky and fireworks in your photo, you can always shoot portrait rather than what we'd normally think of, which is landscape photography. And whatever you plan to do, then make sure that you're staying safe, especially if you're kind of out and about in the dark. So here's a view from Google Maps of Weston-super-Mare. So a couple of times a year, the Grand Pier do a fireworks display for the town and for visitors. I know from previous experience that that tends to be just south of the pier on the beach. And obviously, making sure that we're staying safe when we think about photographing these fireworks, we probably want just to check the tide times, because we wouldn't want to be taking photos and get caught out in the dark by a rising tide. It happens to several visitors in Weston because of the tidal range. Luckily, not very many at night, but we definitely don't want to be one of those. So if the fireworks are going to be about here, and we know the wind direction is going in this direction, then we know most likely that the smoke is going to rise in the fireworks and they're going to head over the pier in this direction. So the best potential places to get firework photos for this event would either be on the beach here if the tide is out and we're nice and safe. So we'd be shooting, get the fireworks, the pier behind, and then a bit of Weston town behind that. Another alternative is to go up onto this bit of land here. So this is a hill. So you'd be looking down on the fireworks, the pier and Weston town centre. But I know, again, up here, parking and getting up to the top of that hill might be a bit of an issue. But it's something to research before the event, and this is all part of your planning. And another, but probably more risky option is to position ourselves here. So what might happen is that we can get a view of the pier, the fireworks, and the smoke will drift in this kind of direction. But if the wind changes direction slightly, we could find ourselves in the path of that smoke, and that might kind of obscure the pier and fireworks. So probably of all these options, this one here is probably the best if it's safe to do so. So there is some settings you can dial into your camera before you leave your nice warm home, and there's a few bits of equipment that are worth considering to get the best photos. So in terms of equipment, you obviously want your camera loaded up with memory cards and your lens as well. And where you plan to be is going to determine what lens you take. So whether you want a wide angle lens to get a nice broad vista of your foreground interest and the night sky with the fireworks, or if you're going to be further away, you might want to consider a zoom lens to get a bit closer into the action. So we're going to be shooting long exposures of fireworks because that allows us to capture multiple fireworks in a single photo. So we need a tripod to make sure that our camera is steady. And ideally, we want to take a remote control as well. So again, that helps to keep the camera steady. If you're pressing the button on top of the camera, what you're going to find is that does introduce a bit of shake into your photos, which could potentially ruin them. If you don't have remote control, you can always use a 2-second timer if your camera has that function built in. Some of them offer kind of 5 and 10 seconds as well. And again, that just allows the camera to settle from when you touch the button to when it starts taking the photo. So you also want to take with you a torch, so you can see where you're stumbling around in the dark and you can take a look at your camera controls. Ideally, if you've got one with a red bulb or red mode, red torches don't show up in photos quite so much. That's why in all the war films about submarines, you always see them switching on to red lights. But how any light of any color gets out of a submarine, I'm not quite sure. Spare batteries, definitely worth taking if you have them. Cold nights for firework displays are going to drain your batteries more quickly. So having a spare set of batteries for your camera and your torch is probably a good idea. And one of the methods we're going to talk about later on involves using a black piece of card. So if that's the method you choose to use, then make sure you pack that before you leave home. So a few settings you can turn on and off before we go out. So turning on any feature that you need to make your remote control work, if that's something that you use. So my Sony camera has a wireless remote control, and that has a menu option to enable it to work. You want to be taking raw photos because you want lots of detail in there that in post-processing you can bring out and do things with. You can take JPEGs as well, but ideally you want to be using RAWs. Some cameras allow you to take RAW and JPEG simultaneously, which is a good feature, but RAWs is what we're looking for. And you want to turn on your manual focus. Because we're going to be out in the dark, your camera's autofocus system is going to hunt to find a clear picture and may fail. So manual focus is going to be best. A couple of things to turn off, image stabilization. So your camera is going to be on a tripod, so you don't need it being stabilized by the camera. And that's just another feature that if you had it left on, it would just eat into your battery life. So that's something we can turn off for now. Another thing to turn off is long exposure noise reduction. So whilst that's quite a good feature normally, we can reduce any noise in our photos in post-production, in Photoshop or Lightroom or DxO, whatever you use. And also if it is left on, it introduces a delay between each of the photos you want to get. And generally for a fireworks display, we want to be getting lots of photos because we want to make the most of the opportunity. And if the camera is stopping us from doing that, it could mean we miss one of the chances for the best photo of the night. So when we're out and about, here's a bit of theory and what settings we might be using. So for anyone that has studied photography, you'll be aware of the exposure triangle. And this basically gets across the idea that these are the three core elements of taking any photo, and changing any one element can be compensated for by changing others or leaving them as they are. So for fireworks, what we're looking for is taking long exposures to get those multiple fireworks. So we're looking for quite a slow shutter speed, so one of several seconds, to allow us to capture lots of those fireworks and lots of light. To compensate for being in the dark and having a long shutter speed, usually we would have quite a high ISO. But in this case, because the fireworks are really bright and we want our night sky to be nice and dark as a nice backdrop, we want to use a low ISO. And for aperture, especially if we are including fireworks and some foreground interest, we want to use a nice mid-range aperture as we would do for most landscape photography. And you'll be using manual mode on your camera, the scary M control, because that's the only way you can control all of these elements in one go. So camera settings. So manually focus to infinity. So you hopefully already put your camera onto manual focus instead of autofocus. And then focus by eye or use focus peaking. Focus peaking is the feature on some cameras that put like a red or colored outline around what's in focus as you change it. That just allows you to be a bit more confident that you're keeping in focus. So really you want to be focusing on something in the distance to infinity. Don't necessarily rely on the infinity mark on your lens if it has it, so that's why you do it by eye. Unless you want to get all arty and you want a nice foreground interest with some blurry fireworks in the background, in which case you'd obviously focus on the foreground interest first. But generally we're looking for infinity or something in the distance because the fireworks are going to be a long way away. So your aperture, you probably want to start at f11. And I say start because like most photos, we're going to take a photo of fireworks, take a quick look at it and say, okay, I now need to tweak a setting to make the next one a little bit better. So we start with f11 for our first photo. If the photo looks under or overexposed, so too dark or too bright, we then change the F number down to f8 or up towards f16. But generally you want to be in that range of f8 to f16, which is why we start in the middle. And remember, because of the power of your camera and the power of the processing tools you've got, always take photos that are too dark rather than too bright, because there's always detail in the darkness that you can pull out in processing. But if photos are too bright, there's no data there for the software to work with. And the ISO, we're going to set that to 100. And if after your first photo that's not working, you can bump it up a little, but you don't want to stray too far from ISO 100. So there's 3 key ways you can get photos of fireworks. And it's worth playing with all 3 to see which one is right for you. And it's all about taking this long exposure, so we're capturing multiple fireworks and we're getting lots of detail. So the first and most simplest way of getting a photo is to also get your camera and tripod set up, camera points in the right direction, your focus all sorted, and then you set a shutter speed of between 6 and 10 seconds. And then when you take the photo, you're going to fire that shutter when you first see the firework launch. So you can either fire that shutter using a button or remote control, or that 2-second delay timer to minimize the shake. So that's going to open the shutter for your kind of 6 to 10 seconds, gather lots of light, gather the light from the fireworks ingrained against the nice, hopefully black sky. And that's your photo done. Fairly simple. So you set it going, press your button, and then if your photo comes out too light or too dark, you can change your shutter speed, aperture, or ISO. This is the simplest way, but it can be a bit hit and miss because you don't know how many fireworks are going to go off while that shutter is open. It's a bit of a gamble, but it has worked for me in the past, and it's where a lot of people start with photographing fireworks. If you want to get a bit more complex, but also have a lot more control, then the second way is probably for you. And this is the method which I now use. So on your camera, rather than using a 6 to 10 second exposure time on your shutter speed, you're going to be bumping that up to bulb mode. So what bulb mode does is it keeps the shutter open until you tell it to close. So usually on a lot of cameras, your shutter speed time will go from kind of 1,000th of a second up to half a second, up to 2 or 3 seconds, all the way up to 30 seconds. And then beyond 30 seconds, you'll probably find bulb mode. Now, bulb mode might have to be enabled in the menu settings somewhere. So have a read of your camera manual before you start playing with that. And if you've not used bulb mode before, it's definitely worth having an experiment before you go out into the dark. So with bulb mode enabled, when we see the first firework launch, we'll press the button on the camera to open the shutter or on the remote control. And then when you've seen a few fireworks and they kind of stop for a pause, or you think that's enough and you want to keep that as one photo, you press the button again, and the shutter will close. So it gives you a lot more finite control over how long that shutter is open for, how many fireworks it sees, and how much light is getting into the sensor. Ideally, you want to use a remote control, like this one from Neewer. So the advantage of remote control is, one, you're not physically pressing the camera, so it's less prone to shaking the camera. There's a nice button, and with bulb mode, what you can do, as well as pressing the button, you can press and then slide the little holder slider upwards, and that will keep the shutter open for as long as you want. So you're not, with the remote control, having to stand there with your finger on the button for a long time. So this one is one of the more advanced remote controls you can get. So there's all sorts of remote controls for all sorts of cameras, wireless and wired. This one is wired, which has its advantages that it's not relying on a potentially dodgy wireless signal to the camera. And it's also what we call an intervalometer. So it can do various things as well as taking a photo, so it might be useful for other projects such as time lapse. So you can set, using various buttons in this display, to take a number of photos over a specific period of time and all sorts of other functions. But for fireworks, all we really want it for is this hold button. And at the moment, you can get these on Amazon for about $26.99. And so the Neewer, along with lots of others, come with adapters that sit on the end of the lead, and that will marry it up to your specific camera make and model. So have a look on Amazon or other photography websites, and I'm sure you'll find lots of choice out there. So the third way, this is one where the bit of black card might come in handy. So similar to the second way we just looked at, we would enable bulb mode. So we have that control over when the shutter opens and when it closes. But we would leave the shutter open, and when the fireworks stop displaying, so in between fireworks or when they go to make a cup of tea or whatever, you would put a piece of black card in front of the lens. And what that does is it stops more light entering the sensor. So it effectively pauses your photo. So when the fireworks start again, you can just whip away the black card you've been holding, and that light from the fireworks that have just launched will then hit the sensor and will add to your existing photo. You don't want to leave the shutter open for too long, because the longer you leave it open, you could increase the amount of noise you get. You can heat up the sensor too much, and that shows kind of any imperfections in your sensor, but it certainly allows you a bit more control. But again, it's a bit hit and miss, but it's one of those things that's probably worth a try. And if you forget your piece of black card, you can always put your hand in front of the lens, but be careful obviously not to give your camera a whack or to change that manual focus, otherwise your photos will come out all blurry. So of the three methods, my preferred one is the second one. The remote control makes it a bit safer, less risk of getting kind of blurry photos or photos that are too long or too short. And you can kind of judge on the night when you've taken your first photo and see how good or bad that's turned out. You can then change that shutter time without having to go into the menu systems of your camera. So here's a few example settings of photos that I've taken. All the background photos that we've used so far haven't been mine. They've been ones from a website called Unsplash, which does royalty-free photos and is worth a look for all sorts of presentations. So this photo, one of my first kind of fireworks photos with a proper camera, back in the days when I used to use Olympus cameras, back in 2014 at Mayflower Park in Southampton. So this was a shutter speed of 4 seconds at ISO 200, aperture f11 at a focal length of 50mm. So on Olympus, because it's a crop sensor, the lens was actually a 25mm lens, but the equivalent full frame focal length is 50. So what you can see is that because the shutter was open for 4 seconds and I wasn't using a tripod, I was hand holding the camera, but I've introduced camera shake. So you can see up here, lots of wiggly lines. You can see the crowd down here being very blurry, almost unrecognizable as people. So that's kind of a good example of why we would use a tripod. So the second photo from that evening, so I'd taken the first photo, taken a quick look, realized it was a bit too wiggly, so I tweaked my settings. So I went for this one down to a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, bumped the ISO up to 1600, which is obviously far too high really, an aperture of 1.8, which is too low, and sticking with that fixed length lens. So for this one, whilst we're getting the crowd kind of better lit and fairly static, there's not too much shake in there. There's a bit of blur because they're out of focus, because I was using a very small f number. You can see that the fireworks are kind of frozen in time and not very pleasing to the eye. So it was a different photo from the first one because I tweaked the settings. Whether it's better or worse than the first one, you make up your mind. And the final photo from that evening, again, I tweaked the settings slightly. So shutter speed 1.6 seconds, ISO 200, f5, and same focal length. So for this photo, I introduced what we call intentional camera movement, or ICM. So I pressed the shutter button, and as soon as the shutter opened for that 1.6 seconds, I twisted the camera in a circular motion, which is why you can see all of these lines kind of going round in a circular way. So it's quite artistic in a way, not necessarily a kind of a great or classic fireworks photo, but it's another method you can try. And obviously, if you're swinging your camera around to get these artistic effects, you obviously don't want it to be on a tripod when you do that. So jumping forward to 2019, this is a fireworks display in Abingdon, Oxfordshire in August, which is a very strange time of year to do a fireworks display, because usually it's very much light in the sky until it gets quite late. But this was a display where they do the fireworks after it gets dark still. It just happens to be quite late at night. So for this one, this I think was when I was using my Sony camera. So this shutter speed of 12 seconds, ISO 100, f13, the focal length of 16 millimeters to get a nice wide crowd shot as well as all the fireworks. So this is one of the kind of better styles of firework photography. So we've got a bit of a crowd. This is as much foreground interest as you could get because the fireworks display didn't have any other kind of vantage points to include any foreground interest. And it also includes the long exposure of 12 seconds, which is why we can see the fireworks going up and then exploding in the sky. So if we were using our second method, I'd press the shutter button on the remote when the fireworks launch. And then when I kind of see them with my eyes explode and then fade away, I would then close that shutter. So that gives me a full set of fireworks, and it gives me them from the beginning of their life, if you like, to the end of their life when they've dimmed themselves out. So a bit of critique, obviously there's a bit of blur somewhere, like this guy, it looks to be a Finding Nemo balloon. There's a tent over here which is a bit hidden by the text, but you might have seen it when the picture first arrived, which is a bit distracting. But it does have a nice dark sky in the background. So for this one, 12 seconds was about spot on. So also on the same evening, this is probably one of my favorite fireworks photos because it doesn't look so much like a firework photo. It looks more like a kind of cathedral made out of fire. You can see the scale against the people in the foreground, and that's why that foreground interest is sometimes good to show you the scale of things. So this was 5 seconds, ISO 100, f8, again at 16 mil. So this was taken later in the evening, so you can see the smoke is starting to appear and obscure the kind of bottom of the photo, but not too bad because we can still see what's going on. And certainly in this part of the photo, there's a few bits of the fireworks that are a bit too bright. So again, remember what I said earlier about always shoot a little bit too dark than too bright, because that is so bright that it would be hard to get any detail out of there. If it was a bit too dark, you could always lighten up. But that one I'm very happy with. I very much like that photo. And then finally, another kind of classic firework photo. So this one almost bang on center of the frame. So 18 seconds, ISO 100, f8, again at 16 mil. So this was towards the end of the evening. So again, kind of lots of smoke now starting to appear in the ground, but we can still see the firework above it. At 18 seconds is a bit of a longer exposure, and therefore you can kind of see the blur in the crowd a bit more. But again, 18 seconds is why we've managed to capture the firework go up to the sky and then drop all whatever it drops as it goes off and explodes. So that was some of my own fireworks photos. And here, if you want to grab a screenshot or download the presentation from the details below, is a cheat sheet. So this is pretty much all of the presentation, the key bits, all on one slide that you can take off or take a screenshot and keep on your phone to refer to at a later date. So we referred to the planning and the Wind Finder app, making sure you're upwind of the smoke, and a reminder that you can shoot in portrait as well as landscape. It reminds you of the various equipment you want to take, including a remote control and torch and spare batteries and your piece of card if you want to just try that method. It reminds you to turn on and turn off various things before you leave your nice warm home for the evening. Reminds about manual focus, aperture settings to begin with, and tweaking within a range. Reminds us that keeping ISO to around 100 or low, and then gives the 3 ways of shooting. And again, I would always recommend option 2 if you can. But the joys of digital photography, obviously you can take lots of photos throughout the evening. I guess a typical firework display lasts for 20 or so minutes. So you can quite easily try all 3 methods in one evening and see what works best for you and your camera equipment. There's no additional cost because it's all digital. But as I say, in my experience, the second method is what tends to work best. So I hope you enjoy your fireworks photography. Enjoy yourselves, stay safe out there, and thank you for watching.